So, who's actually going to start at right guard? Let's talk about it here on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
Ooh-wee! You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. And today on the show, I want to talk about the right guard competition. I did a little bit of tape study on Chris Reed. I want to talk to you about that. I want to talk to you about his competition for that starting right guard spot. I don't think he's going to play center. And also talk about prospect of the day, which will be a possible guard we could draft if we're not happy with any of these options. But let's start with Chris Reed. So thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day every single day. And let's get into it. Let's get into Chris Reed, whose signing, I think, kind of got washed away by other NFL news that was going on that day. And we haven't been able to talk about it much. But I liked the signing initially. Like my first reaction was really positive. My second reaction, still pretty positive. I went and I found kind of some of the flaws, some of the reasons that he isn't a bona fide starter, somebody that's, one of the top guards in the market. I think I get why he's available for as cheap as the Vikings can afford, but I'm still really, really, really into it. So here's what you have to know about me. When I evaluate players, especially offensive linemen and what I call reactive positions that are sort of trying to prevent something from happening, cornerbacks, they try to prevent the pass from being caught. Offensive linemen are trying to prevent, pass disruptions, pressures, and stuff. When it comes to those positions, my method is essentially to skip directly to their worst game. And the reason I do this is because I think you can learn a lot more. I mean, most offensive linemen look really similar when they are winning. And that's probably, if you talk to an O-line coach, they probably would laugh in my face about that. But to me, I have a lot more trouble differentiating how an offensive lineman wins on their best day when they're just kicking a whole bunch of ass. And I did watch some of that too. So this is definitely part of it and how do they win and stuff. But to me, I learn a lot more about an offensive lineman when he's having a bad day. And how does he deal with that? Why does it happen? And am I okay with that? And then we can kind of look after that. We can expand it to, okay, how often does this happen? So for Chris Reed, I skipped directly to the worst game he had at right guard last year, which was against Tennessee. I want to say it was week 8. He went up against Jeffrey Simmons, who he actually did really well against Jeffrey Simmons and actually kind of kicked Jeffrey Simmons' ass, and then struggled a whole bunch with Danico Autry. And that is really, really interesting because of the different styles of those two players. Jeffrey Simmons is a mauler. He's a big boy. He's a big, strong bull rush type, push the pocket type. Danico Autry is finesse. He's a hand fighter. He's a karate kid, if you will. And that was much more of a struggle for Chris Reed, and that can teach us a little bit about his style, right? So here are the traits that I have for Chris Reed. I'll give you the pile of traits. You decide if you like it. He has really, really active hands and really, really active feet. That's what I think you need to know about Chris Reed. He moves his feet a lot. He has a lot of lateral motion, and those active feet are really, really, really good. Here is one of the things that differentiates him from a lineman like Garrett Bradbury. Garrett Bradbury does not have active feet. He kind of plants, and you can get around him that way because he's not moving his feet. He doesn't have the ability to kind of shift one way to the other laterally, and that gets him beat around the edge a lot, which led to him taking a wider pass stance, which led to him being more vulnerable to bull rushes, and that's why he gets bowled over so much. That's sort of the sequence of how that happened. Chris Reed has the ability to not get in that point, and everything that he does is sort of a product of him being 300 pounds and having short arms. Like, he ain't an athlete, man, and that's why he went to Minnesota State Mankato with Adam Thielen back in the day. He's not a super athlete. Now, he has a good relative athletic score. His testing was really good and stuff, but he doesn't have the measurables. Short arms, he's sort of small. That's not great. Got a lot of power, got a lot of agility. He can move that body, but it's not the sort of frame you typically look for in a guard. 300 pounds, a little light for a guard in this day and age. But what comes with that is the lateral agility. He has, the good athleticism to be able to move back and forth, and that makes him really good at picking up stunts and tricks and stuff. If there is, say, a nose tackle who's trying to take him really far outside with his pass rush, and then you have a looping edge rusher who's just trying to speed away and take advantage of that gap, he actually has the agility to cover that ground, if you can kind of track what that means. If one defensive lineman leads him out of position, he can get back into position really quickly if it turns out that was a tricky trick. So that's really exciting. And I think he has the mental wherewithal. He's been in the league a long time. He has the mental wherewithal to deal with that kind of thing. He also has very active hands, and this can get him in trouble sometimes. He's gotten beaten by lunging a little bit, by being a little bit too proactive with his hands. He throws his punch early, he gets caught off balance, and he can kind of get swiped out of the way. It led to a lot of losses in this Tennessee game, and that's probably why it turned out to be his worst game of the year, is because he kept being too aggressive. And that's the other thing about Chris Reed. He's a very aggressive player, especially in pass pro. There's a lot of lunging, and here's the thing. If he can get his hands inside, and he can get his hands inside of your hands, get his hands on your lapel, I've sort of talked about that in previous conversations, like when Chris Reed first signed, we talked about that a little bit. But if he can get his hands kind of on your collarbone, on the inside of your jersey, you're cooked. He's got the strength, the functional strength to really lock you up like that, get your elbows inside and almost lift you a little bit, and then you can't get a good base. It's like, that's a really good way to kind of finish a rep. And then he's got that mean streak, that finish, that torque you down, push you over, get you on the ground. There's a lot of reps with Chris Reed ending up on top of somebody. And when you're the offensive lineman, that's kind of exactly what you want. I want to keep talking about Chris Reed and his competition, and I want to make sure I get to prospect of the day as well. First things first, though, let me talk to you about Grambling. Look, the basketball tournaments are over, but that doesn't mean Grambling's over. There's still NFL draft futures. You can bet on the first overall pick. Amazingly to me, it is Aiden Hutchinson. I don't know. I'm not. Talk me into Aiden Hutchinson, people. To show me that you didn't skip this part, and talk me into why Aiden Hutchinson is like the odds-on favorite to be the number 1 overall pick. But if you want to bet against that, maybe you don't believe it, you can do that at Bet Online. You can bet on anything: pro basketball, pro hockey as well, golf, tennis, MMA. You can even play your favorite Vegas casino games. So head on over to betonline.net and get yourself a Grambling. Bet Online, where the game starts. Hey, thanks again for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day, maybe your first watch of the day. For your second watch of the day, check out the Locked On NFL podcast on YouTube, talking about all the big storylines, kind of a flagship-ish show here on Locked On NFL. Also, check out Locked On Minnesota Sports with Ron Johnson. It's like a Minnesota sports-wide, Wild Twins, us Vikings, everything. Doing a bunch of great stuff there. Can't wait to get a chance to talk to him whenever we can get that scheduled. Let's keep talking about Chris Reed. So we've kind of established he has very active feet. He can anchor too. He's a lot of great recovery. Part of his active feet is that guys will cross in front of him a lot, and it gets him in trouble, right? He kind of is too active. He can get lured out of position, and then a defensive lineman can sort of zig and then zag and get to the other side. But because his feet are active enough, he can use that momentum against him, and he's actually gotten some pancakes that way. If somebody jukes him left and starts to go right, he'll say, yeah, let's go right. I'll just keep pushing you to the right until you fall over, and your momentum's already going that way, so you kind of can't stop me anyways, even if you're Jeffrey freaking Simmons. And it kind of rules. This is why I like Chris Reed so much. He has a really, really great understanding of leverage and stuff. The thing we usually talk about with like wrestling guys going to have an understanding with leverage shows up on his tape. And that's super, super exciting. So we talked about his aggressiveness. We talked about his active hands. There's a lot of Mr. Miyagi stuff going on, a lot of wax on, wax off sort of stuff. And if he mistimes that, or if he throws a bad punch, which can happen to him sometimes, he can get swiped out of the way. In the run game, very good at pulling, very good at kick out blocks, kind of power stuff. But when it comes to combo blocks or climbing to the second level, it gets really, really, really inconsistent. So I'm concerned about his scheme fit in the run game. How much you care about that is up to you. But how much the Vikings are concerned about it, I'm going to guess it's probably a reasonable concern. Now, we don't know the contract details yet as of this recording. I'm going to guess that they're not extremely high. Otherwise, the agent would have linked it to Ian Rappaport immediately or Adam Schefter immediately. So I'm going to guess it's not huge. But so like going off of that assumption, that's probably part of why his value is a little bit low. He played for Carolina, he played for Jacksonville, he played for Indianapolis, and in none of those places do you do this like huge plurality of zone running like you would in the offense. It seems like a Sean McVay disciple would run. And those combo blocks have a number of different problems. It's I think just a matter of polish. He just doesn't look like he practices it a lot, and he hasn't in those teams. So maybe you get him in one camp and you run all zone and you're going to have an easier time. But let's talk about that camp, because this is going to be a competition. This is not going to be one guy anointed with the job. At least I don't think. I don't know. Maybe a journal can ask Kevin O'Connell about it next time he's up in front of the media as who's going to start at right guard. But the way they've been talking about it is that it's a competition, at least up until they signed Chris Reed, but we haven't heard from them since. So that leads me to ask, okay, who is beating this guy in a competition? So let's go through the options. And I think there's three people who feasibly could, in some scenario, I'm not going to go over the Kyle Hintons of the world, but Jesse Davis is probably the most likely one. And it's not that likely. This is as good as it gets, folks. I think Chris Reed's winning the job. I do think it'll be like a genuine competition. Like when they go to camp, he's not going to be anointed the job. I think he will genuinely have to beat out all of these people. I just don't think he's going to have a hard time doing that. But Jesse Davis is probably the most likely person to overtake him. And we've talked about Jesse Davis in the past, and he sort of has this opposite thing with Chris Reed where he's very passive. Chris Reed is very aggressive. And in offensive lineman, that is way better than it is bad. Jesse Davis is passive, and that's way worse than it is good. But there could be a situation where that careful nature from offensive line, that let the game come to you philosophy that Jesse Davis seems to play with, where he really kind of sets up and he lets guys come and he lets guys set up whatever they want to set up, and he tries to get ready for it as well as he can. That can look pretty good in camp if you're up against a certain kind of defensive lineman. So then it depends on how is Harrison Phillips or Dalvin Tomlinson or whoever going to attack these guys in camp, and who's going to look better in the one-on-ones, right? That's going to affect who gets the first team reps. And then you're going to be up against the same guys in the first team reps. Can you beat these guys, et cetera? That's going to be how it plays out in camp. For me, if you are a sit back, let the guy come to you, have your hands up and ready, and kind of you're only countering moves, you sort of only get the best of the guy across from you because he can set up whatever he wants, that's going to be worse, which is why I think Jesse Davis is worse. But let's not forget Wyatt Davis, right? Wyatt Davis is also an option, and we don't really know what we have in him. Now, I really liked the way that he played at Ohio State. I was a huge fan of his before the Vikings took him, and I was doing backflips when they did. It was the only pick of that whole day that I liked. I will admit I came around on Patrick Jones after the draft, but on the day, I only liked that one pick. I was excited about him. And then, of course, it didn't work out, right? He didn't start at all. We've talked about it a whole bunch. If you're unfamiliar with the story, he had an injury a groin injury, I believe it was, or a sports hernia, I think it could have been, which is a really naggy injury, and it's stopped him from being able to kind of get not only into game shape, but get caught up on scheme, get his reps, get himself into the rhythm of the season. And once you're not in the rhythm of the season, and because he couldn't win a job from Dakota Dozier under all these circumstances, he got banished to the scout team. And if you're familiar with the responsibilities of a scout team lineman, you're not developing your own skills. It's not a quiet place to train. It's a place to help defensive linemen prepare for the next week. You're simulating techniques the other guys use. It's a good learning tool, but it's not the kind of thing that's going to get you playing time right away. So he went and worked with Duke Manyweather over the off season. He's really, really focused on coming in and like winning this job. He's sort of the wild card here. And that can be pretty cool. Maybe he comes in and he makes the KJ Osborne leap, right? I think that's totally in the realm of possibility. But he was very clearly not ready to go last year. Didn't work out. It is what it is. And maybe he can make that improvement. And then, of course, let's not forget about the guy that started last year in Oli Udoh. He had an unreal camp. He looked awesome. And he looked like the second best lineman on the team next to Brian O'Neill last year. in training camp. I saw it with my own two eyes. And then it didn't work out as I think some tape got out there on him, and there were some tendencies that defensive linemen realized that they could take advantage of. He had some struggle figuring out who to block. He had some struggle kind of learning the nuances of his own scheme as a guard. The assignment is different, and I think he had trouble learning that. But hey, look, an offseason to study it, blah, blah, blah. Maybe he can come back. He's not short at all on athletic ability. Oli Udoh is a total freak. So if he spent the summer, spent the spring working on how to get a little less handsy, working on how to, control his grabs a little bit more so he doesn't get called for as many holding penalties. I mean, think about Oli Udoh. I think there's a good exercise in this. Think about Oli Udoh. What do you have to fix about him to turn him into a good lineman, right? Like, be specific about it. Don't just say, make him better at everything. Like, no, be specific. What specifically does he need to learn? And then ask yourself, is that reasonable for him to learn in an offseason? I don't think it'll happen, but it could. So there's a lot of suitors, but I do think it is, it's going to be an open competition, but I do think it is Chris Reed gets this job unless somebody else is surprising. And I think that's the dynamic headed into camp. And then after a week of camp, we probably have a better idea about everybody. But there could also be new challengers here, right? You could move one of these guys. I mean, Chris Reed did play some center in preseason. Maybe he goes and competes with Bradbury and they draft someone. So what if they drafted a Zion Johnson? Let's talk about Zion Johnson. He's going to be our prospect of the day here on the Locked On Vikings podcast. And so we'll break him down. So Zion Johnson out of Boston College is a very much, I think, what we've been begging for out of a guard in like the entire Rick Spielman era, like since 2006. He's a mauler. He's like a totally consistent. He's a good pass protector. He's big. He's got the build for it. Like, he's a ready-made prototype guard. Played exclusively left guard at Boston College. So he has to move over to the right side, or you'd have to like move Ezra Cleveland over to the right side. I don't want to do that. That worked out really poorly in 2020. Making him flip his footwork is not something that really took with him, and I don't really see a lot of justification in doing it again. I'd much rather take the rookie, and I mean, look, he's transitioning to the NFL anyways. What's another transition? Let's make him do that. If we're going to do that, right? I'd rather move the rookie than the guy who's like finally starting to settle in and find his place on an NFL starting lineup. But with Zion Johnson, I mean, it's like kind of a boring evaluation, which is like what you want in an O-lineman. He doesn't have the best movement skills, although in ways that I think most people are critiquing him as a tackle for. He's got definitely has the requisite athleticism to play guard in a wide zone and to pull and to reach and do stuff like that. Like, that's fine. It's more about him in pass pro as a left tackle, which is what he played a lot of at Boston College. Doing kick slides and stuff, getting out into space, contending with edge rushers. He seemed maybe a little overmatched there. So moving him into guard is what Boston College did, and that seems to be the path forward for him. So as you're looking at Zion Johnson scouting reports, remember that people are evaluating him as a tackle sometimes, and you kind of have to read between the lines as to like what they mean by that. He also has a bit of a strength of competition thing. So he played at Boston College last year, where he played mostly left guard. But the 2 years before that, he played at Davidson, where in 2020 he played left tackle, and then in 2019 he played left guard again. So that's how you keep that in mind. But look, this dude belongs in the first round. He's scheme versatile. He's got all the athleticism you could ever want. He's got the build you want in a guard. He's 6'3". That's like not necessarily, it's a little short for a tackle. For a guard, you kind of don't care about height. Honestly, shorter can be better sometimes because low man wins. He's just like a ready-made guard. So here's the deal. I feel really good about Chris Reed, but after this whole conversation that we had, it's totally reasonable if you don't. If you don't want a guy that's like maybe going to lunge and get messed up. I mean, that's how TJ Clemmings lost, right? Like, we're a little sore about all this still after all these years. Those lunges can really, really get you in trouble. Rashad Hill got smoked on a bunch of those just last year. So you might not want to commit to a bunch of these. Totally get it. And if you don't want to do that and you want to just say, like, you know what? Rick Spielman got fired in large part because of the offensive line. I know a lot of Kirk Cousins' biggest fans this is the thought process, right? Is they couldn't protect him, and of course he couldn't succeed. Look at that protection. They were 28th every year or whatever in pass blocking and stuff. Get a pass blocker. Let's just use the first rounder, get Kirk Cousins the help he needs, blah, blah, blah. Well, the help he needs is Zion Johnson. And so if you wanted to do that and you weren't as convinced as on Chris Reed as I am, you're certainly not convinced on Jesse Davis. I'm not. I'm probably higher than most people are, and I'm not that high on him. And you don't think Wyatt Davis or Oli Udoh are going to pull a rabbit out of the hat, then yeah, go for it. Let's do one where we draft Zion Johnson. He's, because of, market inefficiencies and stuff and the market factors of drafting a guard, this guy ain't going in the top 15. But back of the first round, this would be the kind of thing we're targeting if we trade back and say, we trade back really far, we get another second rounder or something like that, where we can start to really build depth. That's when you take a guy like Zion Johnson in the first round. I would not anticipate that the Vikings are selecting Zion Johnson. He does not read to me like a hashtag future Viking. But he could be, and it would be pretty cool. He's good at the sport. And so it's really hard for me to be too against that, no matter what the context, right? So that's the prospect of the day. But at the end of the day, Chris Reed should be the right guard. I don't know if the Vikings see it that way. They might pay him less than Jesse Davis. Maybe they just have a different eval on those two guys than I do. That's okay. But if I were in charge, Chris Reed would be the right guard. And you'd make him beat out all the other guys for the position, just in case Wyatt Davis is actually really good and pulls a KJ Osborne turnaround. But I'm giving him first team reps on the first day of camp, and I'm just making him keep those first team reps throughout all of camp. If somebody takes them from him, then great, they do that. That's fine. But otherwise, I feel pretty good about that. And then it's just a matter of how you feel about Bradbury, which I'll refrain from getting into today. We got one more show of this week, and then we move on to next week. But we'll still cover whatever news comes up. We'll cover everything. There's some interesting conversations about with the Bears roster. I might try to get a guest or two to talk about some draft trade stuff. So there's a lot of cool stuff coming up. Stay tuned. In the meantime, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, where you can learn about all sorts of prospects, not just the guard the Vikings probably won't take. So check that out. I'll see y'all tomorrow. And as always, Skull.